Imagine building something for decades, struggling for ratings, fighting for legitimacy, begging sponsors to take you seriously. Then one day, the player you've been waiting for walks through the door. She sells out arenas, she breaks the internet, she makes your league worth talking about at dinner tables across the country. And then, instead of protecting her, you let her get mugged every single night while you look the other way. That's not a hypothetical. That's the WNBA in 2024. And what started as a basketball controversy has quietly evolved into something far more serious. Something with attorneys, civil rights law, and the very real possibility of federal intervention. If you think this is just about hard fouls and hurt feelings, you are not paying attention. Because a lawyer who knows exactly how Washington works has gone on record saying this league may be violating its own star players' legal rights. And the league's response? Silence. The kind of silence that tends to get very loud in a courtroom. This is the full story of Caitlin Clark, the WNBA, and the controversy that refuses to go away, no matter how badly the league wishes it would. To understand why everything that's happening right now matters so much, you first have to understand what Caitlin Clark actually did to this league the moment she arrived. Because Big Impact doesn't even begin to cover it. What she did was borderline unprecedented for women's professional basketball in America. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are where this story becomes impossible to ignore. From the moment Clark was drafted by the Indiana Fever, league app engagement shot up by more than 600%. Not 60%, not 160%, 600%. League Pass subscriptions, the paid streaming product that the WNBA had been trying to grow for years, jumped by over 400%. The Indiana Fever, a franchise that had been largely irrelevant for the better part of a decade, tripled in estimated value. Not doubled, tripled. And that's before you even get to the merchandise. Jersey sales went through the roof. Not just Fever jerseys, the entire league saw a retail surge that it hadn't experienced in years. Lower bowl seats that used to be embarrassingly empty in certain arenas were suddenly sellouts. National media outlets that hadn't paid meaningful attention to the WNBA in years were now sending full broadcast crews, primetime slots, featured segments. Clark's games weren't just being watched, they were being talked about the next morning, dissected, debated, and shared across every platform imaginable. This wasn't manufactured hype, this was a legitimate cultural moment. The kind that leagues spend millions of marketing dollars trying to manufacture and almost never actually achieve. She walked in the door and handed them the golden ticket they'd been chasing since the league was founded back in 1997. And not just because she was talented, though she absolutely is, but because she came in with a national profile built over 4 years of appointment television at Iowa, a fan base that followed her from college into the pros, and a playing style that people who had never once watched a WNBA game suddenly found themselves glued to. She was, by every measurable standard, the most commercially significant thing to happen to women's professional basketball in a generation. The league had to know that. The numbers made it impossible not to know that. And yet, knowing all of that, what followed made absolutely no sense at all. Here's where things get uncomfortable. Because once you accept how valuable Caitlin Clark was to this league, the next set of numbers become genuinely difficult to explain away. In her rookie season, her very first year as a professional, Caitlin Clark absorbed 17% of all flagrant or hard fouls across the entire WNBA. The entire league, every team, every game, every player. One rookie soaked up nearly 1 out of every 5 of the most egregious physical contact called in the whole season. And that's only counting the ones the referees actually bothered to call. Think about what that means proportionately. There are dozens of players in this league. There are multiple games happening simultaneously throughout the season. For one player, one single player, to account for 17% of all hard fouls, the targeting would have to be remarkably consistent, remarkably deliberate, and remarkably obvious. This is not the kind of number that happens by accident. This is not statistical noise. When attorneys and analysts looked at this data, they found that Clark was absorbing hard fouls at more than double the rate of any of her peers. The next closest player wasn't even in the same conversation.
And the people noticing this weren't just angry fans on social media. Rebecca Lobo, a former WNBA player herself and now one of ESPN's most prominent basketball broadcasters, said publicly what plenty of people were thinking privately, that when it comes to Caitlin Clark, the referees were allowing far too much to slide. This is someone who played the game at the highest level, who understands the physical nature of professional basketball, and who still looked at what was happening to Clark and said it went beyond what should be acceptable. That's not a hot take from a random pundit. That's a professional assessment from someone with direct credibility on the subject. Now here's the part that makes the whole thing even harder to process. Nobody is arguing that basketball isn't physical. Nobody is claiming that elite players shouldn't be challenged, pressured, and defended aggressively. That's the game. Hard defense, physical play, contested shots, that's what separates the pros from everyone else. But there is a very clear line between tough defense and targeted physical harassment, and that line is visible in the data. When one player is being hit harder, hit more often, and hit in ways that refs are consistently choosing not to call, that's not tough defense anymore. That's something else entirely, and everybody who was paying close enough attention could see it. The question that nobody in the league seemed willing to answer was simple: why? There's a version of this story where the targeting of Caitlin Clark gets explained away as rough play, competitive intensity, veterans testing a rookie, the usual things people say when they want to move on without looking too closely. But that version of the story has a problem, and the problem is that several people inside the league themselves refused to let it be that simple. Ajayi Wilson is not a background player with an axe to grind. She is a three-time WNBA MVP. She has won a championship with the Las Vegas Aces. She is by almost any measure the most decorated active player in the league. And right around the time Clark was coming in as a rookie, Wilson went on record and said something that stopped a lot of people cold. She said the attention Clark was receiving was absolutely about race. And she went further. She said it boils her blood when people try to claim otherwise. That's not a throwaway comment. That's the best player in the league making a direct and deliberate statement about why a white player was receiving the kind of attention that black players in the WNBA had not received, despite years of exceptional talent and effort. And she's not wrong about the history. Before Caitlin Clark ever stepped onto a WNBA court, there were outstanding players, brilliant, skilled, athletic women who spent entire careers in this league without a fraction of the media coverage, endorsement dollars, or mainstream recognition that Clark received almost immediately. That disparity is real, that frustration is real, and Wilson put it into words that were impossible to ignore. But here's where it gets complicated. Acknowledging that history, that black players were undervalued and underexposed for years, is not the same thing as justifying what was happening to Clark on the court. You can hold both of those truths at the same time. The decades-long lack of attention given to black women in the WNBA is a legitimate grievance, and the physical targeting of one player at a rate that far exceeded everyone else in the league is also a real problem. One doesn't cancel out the other. Both things can be happening simultaneously, and pretending otherwise helps nobody. What made the league's position so untenable was that they refused to engage with any of it. Not the racial history, not the targeting data, not the comments from their own MVP. The WNBA's response to a situation that touched on race, workplace safety, and civil rights law was essentially nothing. And in situations like this, silence isn't neutrality. Silence is a choice, and it's a choice with consequences. If the WNBA was hoping this controversy would stay confined to sports talk radio and social media comment sections, things got considerably more serious when Sean Milan entered the picture. Milan is the founder of Origin Advocacy, a Washington, D.C.-based consulting and lobbying firm. He has spent nearly 15 years working in and around the federal government, for Senator Marsha Blackburn, for Senator Ted Cruz, and in the Trump administration, including time in the White House itself. He is not a basketball analyst. He is not a celebrity commentator. He is an attorney who understands how federal law works, how government investigations get triggered, and how the language you use in a public forum can signal to things to people who know how to read between the lines.
Mallon wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal about what was happening to Caitlin Clark, and it caught the attention of people who might otherwise never have engaged with a WNBA story. Because Mallon wasn't writing about fouls and feelings, he was writing about workplace law. Specifically, he was writing about hostile work environments, and he made a case that what was happening to Clark on a WNBA basketball court met the legal definition of exactly that. The argument is straightforward, even if the implications are anything but. A professional basketball court is Caitlin Clark's place of employment. The WNBA is her employer. When employees are subjected to repeated, targeted, racially motivated mistreatment in their workplace, mistreatment that their employer is aware of and chooses not to address, that can constitute a hostile work environment under federal law. It doesn't matter that the workplace has a shot clock and hardwood floors instead of fluorescent lights and cubicles. The law applies regardless of the industry. And here is the specific law Mallon was pointing to, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Title VII prohibits discrimination in employment on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It is one of the foundational pieces of anti-discrimination legislation in American history. And according to Mallon's reading of the situation, if Caitlin Clark was being physically targeted at a disproportionate rate, and if that targeting was connected, even partially, to her race, then the league's decision to allow it to continue without meaningful intervention could constitute a violation of federal civil rights law. That's a significant claim, and the reason it landed so hard is because the person making it wasn't doing it casually. Mallon knows what it means to use the words hostile work environment in the same sentence as a named individual and a named organization. He knows that language sends a specific signal. He knows that attorneys and government officials pay attention when those words appear in a major national publication. The statement wasn't just commentary, it was, in the language of Washington insiders, a warning shot. One of the instinctive responses to the idea of federal involvement in a WNBA controversy is to dismiss it as an overreach. Sports are sports, government should stay in its lane, let the league handle its own problems. But the history here tells a very different story, and it's worth spending a moment on that history because it changes the calculus considerably. The federal government has intervened in professional and amateur sports more than once, and in some cases, the results were seismic. The Larry Nassar case involving USA Gymnastics didn't stay within the walls of that organization. It became a federal criminal investigation, a congressional hearing, a national reckoning. The NFL's handling of concussion research, the deliberate minimization of traumatic brain injury data, drew federal attention, congressional scrutiny, and years of damaging coverage. The steroid era in baseball led to congressional hearings that put some of the sport's biggest names under oath on national television. More recently, the federal government engaged with NCAA swimming and gymnastics cases as recently as 2024. These were not small, obscure issues. These were major, established sports institutions that believed their internal processes were sufficient and found out the hard way that when the conduct in question touches on health, safety, or civil rights, the federal government does not tend to stay on the sidelines indefinitely. The WNBA is not too small to attract that kind of attention. In fact, given that the controversy involves one of the most talked about athletes in the country right now, the opposite might be true. The bigger the name at the center of the story, the more political traction the story has. And Mallon made a point that cuts right to the heart of why the league's inaction is so baffling. The WNBA doesn't need a congressional subpoena to fix this. They don't need a federal investigation to force their hand. They don't need lawyers and depositions and government oversight. They need to tell their referees to call fouls when fouls happen. That's it.
The entire problem, the targeting, the dangerous physical play, the liability, can be addressed with a simple officiating directive. Call the fouls, enforce the rules that already exist, signal clearly that using a player as a physical target will not be tolerated. The solution is sitting right there, completely within the league's control, requiring zero outside intervention. And for whatever reason, incompetence, internal politics, or something more troubling, they are not doing it. That gap between how easy the fix is and how steadfastly the league refuses to implement it is what makes the whole situation feel like something more than just a management failure. And it's exactly the kind of gap that federal investigators and congressional staffers tend to notice. If you want to understand just how poorly the WNBA is handling this, all you have to do is compare it to how the NBA has historically dealt with situations involving its most valuable players. The contrast is almost embarrassing.
Think back to when a young LeBron James first entered the NBA. He was immediately targeted. Physical defenders, hard fouls, opponents who wanted to send a message to the kid everyone was calling the next great one before he'd played a single professional game. This was basketball. This was expected. But here's what happened when the targeting started to cross a line. The NBA responded. Officiating directives were adjusted. Messages were sent throughout the league. It was made abundantly clear that certain types of hits on certain types of players would not be tolerated. The league protected its investment, not out of sentimentality, but out of cold, rational business logic. LeBron James was the future of the league, and the future of the league was not going to get hurt because someone decided to make a statement with a cheap shot. Adam Silver, the NBA commissioner, is known for being visible when the league's biggest stars are involved in controversy. You can disagree with his decisions, but you cannot argue that he disappears when things get complicated. When problems arise involving top-tier talent, the league is present, engaged, and responsive. That's what competent sports governance looks like. Now look at the WNBA. Their most commercially significant player in decades is absorbing hard fouls at nearly double the rate of anyone else in the league. Their own MVP has publicly attributed the situation to racial resentment. A Washington attorney with federal government experience has used the words hostile work environment and Title VII in a national publication, and the league's response has been, functionally, nothing. No officiating directives announced publicly, no statement addressing the disproportionate foul data, no acknowledgement of the legal framing that Malin introduced, just silence and the vague hope that the story burns itself out. It won't burn itself out. Stories like this don't burn out. They build, they accumulate, they pick up legal language and media coverage and political interest until they become something the league can no longer pretend not to see. The NBA learned to get ahead of these situations. The WNBA appears to be learning nothing. Set aside the legal arguments for a moment. Set aside Title VII and hostile work environments and the federal precedents. Just think about what practically happens if Caitlin Clark goes down with a serious injury, a bad ankle, a torn ligament, a concussion, as a direct result of the physical targeting the league has allowed to continue unchecked. The immediate fallout would be severe. Sponsors who signed on because of Clark's presence in the league would start asking hard questions. Broadcast partners who had invested in covering WNBA games specifically because of the ratings bump Clark provided would start reconsidering their contracts. The sellout crowds that had been filling arenas would stop filling them as reliably. The jersey sales, the app engagement, the subscription numbers, all of it built substantially on the back of one player would take a hit that the league might not recover from quickly. But beyond the immediate financial damage, there would be a credibility collapse, because at that point, it would no longer be possible for the WNBA to claim ignorance. The data was public. The legal arguments were in the Wall Street Journal. The ESPN commentators had said it on air.
If the league allowed a clearly documented pattern of targeted physical play to continue, and that player was then seriously injured, the institutional negligence would be undeniable. And at that point, you're no longer talking about a PR problem. You're talking about the kind of liability exposure it turns into multi-year litigation. And here's the part that makes the league's behavior most difficult to understand. This isn't a situation where the people in charge can claim they didn't know. They know. The data is their data. The games are their games. The attorneys aren't sending them private letters. They're writing in national newspapers. The awareness of the problem is total, and that total awareness, combined with total inaction, is precisely what would make any eventual legal case against the league so devastatingly easy to construct. Game footage is discoverable in litigation. Press statements are discoverable. Internal communications are discoverable. If this reaches the point where a formal complaint is filed, lawyers will go through everything, and the paper trail of a league that knew about a potentially racially motivated hostile work environment and chose not to address it is not a paper trail anyone in league leadership should want to see read aloud in a deposition. The league's silence isn't protecting them. It's building the case against them, one unanswered news cycle at a time. While league officials sit in their silence, the conversation around Caitlin Clark has splintered into something that the WNBA's PR team definitely did not plan for. Because what started as a basketball story has become a culture war flashpoint. And once something becomes a culture war flashpoint, it stops being manageable through normal communication strategy.
Clark's supporters are loud, organized, and deeply invested. They track every hard foul, they post video compilations. They are generating a constant stream of content that keeps the conversation alive across platforms, even during the off-season. Their core argument is simple. The league's biggest star is being physically targeted beyond what the rules allow, and the officials and administration are doing nothing about it. They want accountability. They want officiating consistency. They want the league to protect its players. On the other side, you have people who view the entire controversy as inflated, racially coded, and weaponized by a right-wing media ecosystem that found in Caitlin Clark a convenient vehicle for narratives about reverse discrimination and threatened white womanhood. They argue that what looks like targeting is just tough professional defense, that the foul numbers are being cherry-picked, and that the real story is about decades of black women being overlooked in a league that now only gets attention when a white player shows up. That argument also has real substance to it. It's just that in the public arena, the nuance tends to get lost in favor of the loudest, most emotionally satisfying version of the story. And then there's a third group that doesn't particularly care about basketball at all, but finds the drama irresistible. These are the people posting viral clips of Clark getting fouled, not because they follow the Fever's season stats, but because the footage is viscerally striking and generates engagement. These viewers don't have any loyalty to the nuance of the conversation. They're there for the spectacle. And their participation is actually one of the most significant pressure points on the league, because viral spectacle brings eyeballs, and eyeballs bring the kind of media attention that eventually becomes impossible for even the most communications-averse organization to ignore. The WNBA is operating under the assumption that if they stay quiet, the factions will eventually get tired of arguing and move on. But here's what they're missing. Each new incident adds fuel. Each new foul that doesn't get called gives the content creators more material. Each week the league says nothing, the legal commentary gets cited again, re-examined, shared further. The controversy isn't cooling down, it's being fed. Strip away all the legal language, strip away the political commentary, the viral clips, the arguments about race and resentment and media bias. Get down to the absolute core of what is happening here, and you find something remarkably simple. A professional sports league has a duty to ensure that its players are not being physically targeted in ways that violate the established rules of the sport. That's not a controversial principle, that's just what a sports league is supposed to do. It doesn't matter if you love Caitlin Clark or find the attention she receives excessive. It doesn't matter if you think the media coverage is racially skewed or perfectly proportionate. Those are separate conversations with real complexity and no easy answers. But the question of whether a league should tell its referees to call flagrant fouls when flagrant fouls occur, that question should have an obvious answer. Of course they should. That's not preferential treatment. That's called officiating a professional sport according to its own rules. The frustrating irony here is that the WNBA is gambling with the very thing that has kept it financially viable for the past couple of seasons. Every player in that league benefits from Caitlin Clark's presence. The increased television revenue flows to the whole organization. The endorsement environment that a more prominent league creates helps every player's earning potential. The visibility that comes with actually being on national television gives every player a platform they didn't have before. The rising tide lifts everyone, and by allowing the person most responsible for that tide to be treated like an open gym liability, the league is risking the entire wave. There is also something worth saying about what this moment reveals about the people running the WNBA. Because if the solution really is as simple as sending officiating directives, and by every account it is, then the failure to do so is not a strategic decision. There is no strategic upside in allowing your top draw to absorb 17% of all hard fouls in your league. There is no media strategy under which ignoring a published legal argument in the Wall Street Journal is the smart play. There is no long game where allowing potential Title VII exposure to metastasize leads somewhere good. What the inaction reveals is either a stunning degree of organizational dysfunction or something more deliberate that the league cannot afford to have examined too closely. Neither option is flattering. There's a version of this story that ends quietly. The league adjusts its officiating. The targeting data improves. The legal commentary fades. Clark continues to play, continues to generate revenue, and the WNBA emerges from the controversy bruised but intact, maybe even having learned something meaningful about protecting its players. That version is still possible. It just requires the league to do something it has so far refused to do: acknowledge the problem openly and act on it with the kind of visible urgency the situation demands. But there's another version. And this other version is the one that keeps the league's legal counsel awake at night. In this version, the league continues to do nothing. The targeting continues or escalates. The legal arguments that Milan introduced get picked up by additional attorneys, additional publications, additional political figures looking for a story that generates easy coverage. A formal complaint gets filed. Congressional staffers start drafting hearing requests. The discovery process begins, and suddenly every internal communication the league has sent about Caitlin Clark's situation becomes a public document. And the question that gets asked in those hearings, the question that gets repeated on every cable news program that covers the story, is devastatingly simple. You knew, and you did nothing. Why? There is no good answer to that question. There is no press release that makes that question go away. There is no media strategy, no spokesperson, no carefully worded statement that neutralizes the damage once a federal investigation with real subpoena power starts pulling on that thread. The time to avoid that outcome is now, before the thread gets pulled, before the first formal complaint, before the first congressional inquiry, before a serious injury turns a legal theory into an open and shut liability case. The WNBA has been given something extraordinarily rare in professional sports: a genuine second act, a chance to matter in the mainstream conversation, to grow its revenue, to expand its audience, to finally build the kind of financial foundation that makes the league sustainable long-term. Caitlin Clark didn't just give them a good season, she gave them a window, a narrow, precious window to become something bigger than they have ever been. And right now, they are standing in that window, doing nothing while the clock runs. Call the fouls, enforce the rules, protect the players, all the players, because that's the job. And if the league can't do the job, if the politics and the resentments and the dysfunction are so deep that they cannot manage to do the one thing that is obviously, plainly, undeniably required of them,
then the people raising legal alarms right now are not the problem. They're just the first ones to say clearly what everyone paying attention already knows. Something is very wrong here, and pretending otherwise isn't going to make it less wrong. It's just going to make the reckoning, when it finally arrives, a whole lot worse. The WNBA can protect its star or wait for someone else to force them. But one way or another, legally, politically, financially, the bill for this silence is going to come due. The only question left is how much it's going to cost when it does.